The monitor beeped in sharp, deliberate rhythm. The surgical light glared down with a sterile brilliance, casting harsh shadows across the faces behind masks and visors. In the operating room of Greenville Regional Medical Center, tension was thick as smoke. You could feel it in the way the head nurse's fingers twitched near the surgical tray, or how Dr. Rowan's breathing grew slower with each passing second. His voice cut through the silence, low but deliberate. "I've never seen anything like this." Nurse Daniels blinked, leaning in. "Doctor?" Rowan didn't answer immediately. He leaned closer to the exposed section of the patient's skull. The room, until now filled with the steady hum of machines and occasional clinking of tools, became utterly still. "This isn't a tumor," he said. "This is metal." There was a sharp intake of breath from someone behind him. Daniel's voice trembled. Like a plate from a previous surgery." Rowan shook his head. "No, it's embedded, but it doesn't look placed. This is something else." He reached for a probe, carefully tapping the edge of the foreign object buried just beneath a fine web of calcified tissue. It gave off a dull, cold ping. "It's shrapnel," Rowan said finally. His tone was part shock, part awe. "Military grade, probably from artillery." Gasps echoed faintly beneath surgical masks. A resident stepped forward. "But how? He's lived like this. For how long?" Rowan exhaled slowly, gaze never leaving the pale surface of exposed bone and metal. Judging by the calcification, the scarring, easily 4 or 5 decades. The patient's vitals held steady on the monitor beside them. That only made the moment more surreal. Someone whispered, "How do you live with a bullet in your brain for 50 years? No one answered. Then came the sound, quiet but eerie, of a soft plop, as Rowan gently loosened the object and placed it into a stainless steel dish. It hit with a hollow clang that echoed off the tiled walls. That sound, like the closing of a long-forgotten vault, seemed to trigger something in the air. Eyes turned toward a small, worn object resting on the nearby table, a brown canvas baseball cap, well-used, sweat-stained, with its brim curled from years of wear. The man had brought it into the operating room, had asked, no, insisted, that it not be taken far. He'd held it in his lap right up until the anesthesia took hold, his knuckles white around the brim, as though letting go of it might mean losing more than just a hat. They didn't understand then, but now, standing in the glow of the harsh surgical light, surrounded by the sterile tools and scientific facts, they were beginning to. That hat wasn't just fabric. It was armor, and what lay beneath it wasn't just an old man's scar. It was a secret carried through war, grief, and silence. A story buried beneath decades of quiet isolation, of long walks in the park with no destination, of conversations avoided, of rooms left dark and untouched. One of the nurses, unable to stop herself, whispered under her breath, "Why would someone hide this for so long?" She wasn't asking anyone in particular. And yet, as if summoned, the silence answered her, not with words, but with presence, with the weight of a man's entire life, compacted into a hidden sliver of metal lodged in his brain, and the stubborn refusal to ever take off that damn hat. And so begins the story of Frank Delaney, a man who wore a cap not for the sun, nor for fashion, but because beneath it lived a reminder of a day he never stopped reliving. A man whose greatest wound was not visible, not until now. Frank Delaney lived in a modest wooden house, nestled between 2 towering oaks at the edge of Greenville, South Carolina. The paint on the porch had long since begun to peel, exposing splinters beneath the faded white. Every morning, at exactly 6 a.m., Frank would step outside with a steaming mug of black coffee in his hand, take a slow look at the world, and then return inside without a word. He was 78 years old, though his posture remained mostly upright, military straight, but there was a weariness in his shoulders that no amount of morning routine could conceal. He moved with deliberation, like someone who had learned to conserve motion the way others conserved breath. Every step had a purpose, every gesture a story, and he always wore the same brown canvas cap, sun-bleached, worn along the seams, and faded at the brim. It was a part of him, like the lines on his face or the veins in his hands. It never left his head, not when he slept, not when he showered, not even in the stillness of his solitude. Neighbors had grown used to it, the way small towns do. People whispered but didn't ask. They called him Old Hat Frank, a nickname that was both affectionate and laced with a touch of uneasy curiosity. Children stared. Adults offered polite nods but kept conversation minimal. Everyone had heard a version of his story, but no one knew the truth. Inside his home, the air was cool and dim, filled with the faint scent of old wood, leather, and a trace of tobacco. Though Frank hadn't smoked in years, his furniture was simple, functional, nothing modern, nothing loud. On the wall above the fireplace hung a black and white photograph in a wooden frame, slightly crooked. A younger Frank stood in full Marine Corps dress blues, flanked by a slender woman with intelligent eyes and a tired smile. Helen, his late wife. She wore a plain dress and held his arm tightly, as if unsure whether the moment was one of return or farewell. Next to the photo, on a small shelf, was a folded American flag in a glass triangle case, a Purple Heart, and a military-issued dog tag that had long lost its shine. Below it sat an antique pocket watch that had stopped at exactly 3:17, an object that Frank never tried to fix, as though that frozen moment needed to be preserved in amber. Frank's days were predictable. He cooked for one, he read books with cracked spines and dog-eared pages, and he sat for hours by the window, watching the world move on without him. He listened to the radio instead of watching TV, mostly jazz, sometimes old news broadcasts. Once in a while he'd go fishing at the lake on the edge of town, but even there he kept to himself. He didn't talk about the war, not to anyone, not even to Michael, his only son, whom he hadn't seen in over 6 years. Their last conversation had ended in raised voices and unfinished sentences. Michael had accused him of emotional absence, of never being there even when he was physically present. Frank had said nothing in return, just stared out the window and let the silence speak for him. The truth was more complicated than either of them could articulate. Frank loved his son, fiercely, but expressing it had always been a struggle. Somewhere between the trenches of Vietnam and the quiet collapse of his wife's health, Frank had learned to seal his heart inside the same vault that held his memories, locked tight, guarded. He had mourned Helen in private. No tears, no long phone calls to friends or family. He had simply folded her clothes, kept her perfume bottle on the dresser, and refused to sleep on her side of the bed. The cap stayed on, always. It wasn't just a habit. It wasn't superstition or stubbornness. It was protection, from the cold, from the world, from himself. When Helen passed, the loneliness hit him not like a wave but like a vacuum. A hollowing out, the silence became louder, the walls closer, and his thoughts more relentless. And the hat, well, it became his shield. Sometimes in the dead of night, Frank would sit on the back porch, staring up at the stars, murmuring Helen's name as though the sky might respond. He never told anyone about the dreams, vivid flashes of jungle trees, fire, the crack of gunfire, the metallic tang of blood in his mouth. He'd wake with his hands clenched, drenched in sweat, breath caught between a scream and a whisper. But by morning, it was back to coffee at 6, and silence at breakfast. There was one neighbor, Mrs. Adeline Moore, a retired schoolteacher in her late 60s, who occasionally brought over homemade pies or casseroles, which Frank always accepted with quiet nods and placed gently into his fridge. She tried to make small talk, once even asked about the hat. Frank just smiled. "Keeps my thoughts in line," he said. She never asked again. Despite everything, Frank wasn't bitter, just withdrawn, as though his world had narrowed to the 4 walls of his home and the span of his own memory. He didn't resent people for not understanding. He'd long stopped expecting them to. Every now and then, he would stand in front of the mirror, hat still on, and trace the faint line of the scar near his temple. You could barely see it unless you knew where to look, but he knew, and it pulsed with the weight of something unspoken. His body was aging, but his mind remained sharp, observant. He noticed when the mailman changed routes. He noticed when birds migrated earlier than usual. He remembered the name of every soldier he ever served with, even the ones who never made it back. What he didn't remember, or perhaps chose not to, was how to let go. Frank Delaney was not just an old man with a hat. He was a monument to survival, to grief, to endurance. And beneath that worn canvas lay a truth he'd carried for half a century, not just a wound, but a story waiting to be told. It started with a flicker. Frank was in the kitchen, a pot of water beginning to boil, the early morning light casting long strips of shadow across the worn linoleum floor. He reached for the tea tin on the top shelf, a move he had done hundreds, maybe thousands of times, but this time his hand trembled. Not a violent shake, just a subtle hesitation, like a forgotten note in a familiar melody. He blinked. It passed. Later that day, he found himself standing in the hallway for several minutes, unsure of why he'd walked there in the first place. He checked his pocket, then the wall clock, then the front door, as though one of them held the answer. But nothing did. Still, he didn't think much of it. Old age, slowing down, nothing unusual. But then came the dizziness. Not just a moment of imbalance, but a wave, like the ground tilted beneath him. He gripped the edge of the kitchen table, heart pounding, eyes wide, waiting for it to stop. It did, eventually, but left behind a residue of unease that clung to him like damp air. The worst came 2 nights later. Frank was polishing a picture frame, the one of Helen, the one that always sat on the mantel, when he felt something warm trickle down the side of his scalp. He thought it was sweat at first, wiped it absent-mindedly with the back of his hand. But when he looked down, his fingers were stained with blood. He stood motionless for a moment, blinking at the dark red smear like it belonged to someone else. Then, wordlessly, he stepped into the bathroom, turned on the light, and leaned toward the mirror. There was a small, raw spot near his temple just beneath the edge of his cap. A thin line had opened along the scar, and from it, a slow, deliberate trickle ran down toward his cheekbone. Frank didn't panic. He washed it quietly, dabbed it with antiseptic, and pulled his cap back on. Pressed the brim down a little tighter. In his mind, there was no real danger. It was a flare-up, a fluke, the body doing strange things after 78 years of wear and tear. No need to worry the neighbors, no need to call a doctor. He had been through worse. Besides, who would he even call? Michael? No. That door had been closed too long, and Frank had never been good with apologies, especially for things he didn't know how to explain. The bleeding stopped. That was enough for him. But in the days that followed, the headaches came. Not stabbing, not blinding. Just dull, persistent, like a distant drum that never quite faded. He ignored it, took a few aspirin, poured himself a glass of whiskey instead of tea, kept moving. He didn't tell anyone, didn't write it down, didn't make an appointment. He kept wearing the cap, always the cap. And yet, something had changed. Each time he caught his reflection, he lingered a moment longer. Each time he reached for the photograph of Helen, his hand hesitated an inch before the frame, as if even the act of remembering had become heavier. One afternoon, while walking back from the grocery store, a teenager on a skateboard zipped by and laughed. "Hey, old man, you ever take that hat off?" Frank didn't respond, but he touched the brim as he walked, not out of anger, out of instinct, like a soldier checking his gear. Back home, he sat in his favorite chair and stared out the window, his grocery bag untouched beside him. Outside, a neighbor was mowing their lawn. Birds chirped. A cat curled on a sunlit porch rail. But inside Frank's head, something pulsed. A pressure, not painful, not yet. Just there. Waiting. He thought about Helen, how she used to run her fingers along his temple when he couldn't sleep, how she'd once said, "You keep so much in that head of yours. I just wish you'd let some of it out." He hadn't. Not then. Not after the war. Not even after she died. He'd buried it all beneath layers of silence. And a cap. Frank stood slowly and walked toward the small mirror by the front door. He tilted his head slightly and looked. The scar was barely visible beneath the edge of the cap, but he knew where it was. Knew it like a map he'd memorized in his bones. There was something under there, something he hadn't faced in 5 decades, and now it was waking up. The knock at the door was unexpected. Frank had just finished stacking the last of his firewood when he heard it. 3 firm raps against the front door, sharp and impatient. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly noon. Too late for deliveries, too early for Mrs. Moore's casseroles. He wiped his hands on a towel and walked slowly to the door, opening it with a creak. Michael stood there, 6'1", jacket in hand, his eyes scanning his father's face before darting to the familiar brown cap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Michael broke the silence first. "You gonna let me in?" Frank stepped aside, still holding the towel, and motioned toward the living room. "Wasn't expecting company," he said flatly. Michael walked in, surveying the house like a man revisiting the ruins of a former life. Nothing had changed. The same furniture, the same photo of Mom on the mantel, the same faint scent of coffee and dust, and of course, the same man sitting across from him, armored in silence and cotton. "I was in Atlanta for work," Michael said, settling into the chair across from Frank. "Decided to keep driving." Frank gave a slow nod. "You hungry?" "No." They sat for a few minutes with only the sound of the clock ticking in the background. Michael watched his father carefully, the slow movements, the stiffness in his shoulders, the faint twitch beneath the brim of his hat. "I heard from Aunt Rose," Michael said. "She said you looked pale when she saw you at the pharmacy." Frank shrugged. I'm old. You're bleeding. Frank stiffened. What? Michael pointed. Right there. Just behind your ear. It's dried now, but it's still visible. Frank reached up instinctively, fingers brushing against the dried trail of blood. He hadn't noticed it. Not today. I must have nicked myself shaving. You don't shave that high up? Frank said nothing. He stood, walked to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water. His hand trembled slightly, but he masked it by turning away. Michael followed. Dad! Something's wrong. And don't say it's nothing because I can see it. You're not walking steady. You've got blood behind your ear. And you keep touching your head like it's about to explode. Frank set the glass down with more force than necessary. I'm fine. Michael stepped closer, his voice low but firm. No, you're not. Frank met his eyes then. For the first time in years they locked, father and son, two men with the same stubborn jawline and deep-set eyes, both carrying wounds they refused to speak of. I don't need a doctor, Frank said, softer now. I've lived through worse. Michael exhaled. This isn't about being tough. This is about being stupid. That earned a flash of anger. Frank turned away, grabbing the towel again, folding and refolding it in his hands like it might give him something to hold on to. Michael's voice cracked. You think I came all this way to argue? I came because I don't want to bury another parent. The silence stretched. Then Frank said, without turning, I don't like hospitals. I know, Michael said, but you like dying less, right? Frank finally faced him again. The weight of the conversation hung in the air between them. The years they hadn't spoken. The phone calls unanswered. The holidays skipped. The fights never resolved. You take me, Frank said quietly, but you don't ask me what they find. Michael blinked. What? You heard me. If I go, it's with that rule. Michael swallowed, his throat tight. Fine, but we go today. Frank looked down, then to the side, then finally nodded. Let me get my coat. He reached for it and paused, one hand still gripping the sleeve. Don't forget your hat, Michael said, half sarcastic, half defensive. Frank gave a faint smile. Wouldn't dream of it. And they drove in silence, the radio off, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. The hospital loomed ahead, tall and gray against the afternoon sky, sterile in its functionality. Frank kept one hand on the brim of his hat the entire ride. In the waiting room, Frank sat stiffly in a plastic chair, while Michael filled out the paperwork. A nurse called them in after 15 minutes, leading them to a small consultation room. The doctor, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a clipboard, introduced herself as Dr. Lin. We'll start with a few scans, she said gently, just to be safe. Frank nodded once. Michael sat in the corner, fingers tapping his knee, watching everything. In the hallway outside the radiology suite, as they waited for the technician to set up, Michael leaned in. You ever think about telling me what's under that thing? Frank didn't look at him. You ever think about asking before today? Touché? The CT scanner hummed to life with a cold, mechanical efficiency, surrounding Frank with the sterile embrace of modern medicine. He lay still on the sliding platform, hands crossed gently over his chest, the brim of his cap folded neatly in Michael's lap outside the room. It was the first time in decades Frank had been without it. Michael watched through the glass as the technician adjusted settings. The pale green glow of the monitor flickered, casting his father's silhouette in ghostly outline. Frank stared upward at the circular ring above him, eyes fixed on the metal framework as it spun and clicked and gathered secrets. He didn't move. He didn't blink. To an outsider, he looked like any old man being scanned for a routine headache. To Michael, it felt like witnessing something sacred, or surgical. A moment where history was being peeled back. When it was over, they waited. A nurse led them to a small exam room. The lights were too bright, the chairs were too plastic, and the silence between them had returned like an old friend. Familiar but unwelcome. Michael handed the cap back to his father without a word. Frank took it, stared at it in his hands. He didn't put it on. Dr. Lin returned 15 minutes later, a folder in hand, her expression carefully neutral. She sat on the stool across from them and placed the folder on the desk. We have the results, she said. Michael sat forward. Is it a tumor? Dr. Lin shook her head slowly. No, not a tumor. She paused, opened the folder, and turned the monitor on the desk toward them. A black and white image appeared, slices of Frank's brain rendered in cross-section. The grainy, layered view showed structures, shadows, and something else. A bright, angular shard, embedded deep near the top left quadrant of his skull. What is that? Michael asked. Dr. Lin tapped the screen gently. A metallic foreign object, roughly 3 centimeters in length, appears to be lodged between the outer dura and the cortical surface of the brain. Michael blinked. Wait, are you saying that's inside his head? Frank said nothing. His eyes were locked on the image, frozen, still. Yes, Dr. Lin replied. It's not a recent injury. Based on calcification and the surrounding tissue response, this object has been in place for decades. Michael turned to his father. Dad? Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. 1969. Da Nang. Dr. Lin looked at him, surprise softening the corners of her mouth. You served? Frank nodded. Artillery burst. Shrapnel. Hit the side of my head. Field hospital couldn't take it out. Said I'd die if they tried. So they closed it up. Sent me home. Michael's jaw clenched. You never told me. Frank still didn't look at him. Didn't see the point. Dr. Lin glanced between the two of them, then cleared her throat gently. Normally, such a foreign body would either be removed or cause serious complications. The fact that it remained stable for so long is remarkable. Michael ran a hand down his face. But now it's not stable, is it? No, Dr. Lin said. We believe the tissue around it is beginning to swell, possibly pressing against adjacent structures. That could explain the dizziness, disorientation, even the bleeding. It may also be affecting cognitive function, subtly at first. Frank finally spoke, eyes still on the scan. So what now? Dr. Lin hesitated. We need to do further imaging, MRI, possibly angiography. But ultimately, this may require surgical removal. Michael leaned forward, alarmed. Wait, brain surgery? At his age? Frank turned to him. I'm right here, you know. Michael backed off. Sorry, I just mean, is that safe? Dr. Lin folded her hands. It carries risk, yes. But leaving it in carries risk too. If the swelling continues, it could lead to seizures, hemorrhage, or worse. There was a long pause. Frank sat back in the chair, expression unreadable. He looked at the monitor again, as though trying to place himself inside the image, trying to remember not just the explosion, but the moment the metal entered and never left. He reached up slowly, touched the brim of the cap in his lap. It's been with me longer than either of you, he said. Michael's voice was softer now. You don't have to keep carrying it. Frank gave a thin smile. I don't think I know how to let it go. Dr. Lin stood. You don't have to decide now. I'll schedule follow-up imaging. We'll build a plan together. You'll have options. Frank looked at her for a long moment. No, do it. Let's get it out. Michael turned sharply. Dad, are you sure? Frank finally looked him in the eye. I didn't come here to get patched up again. Not this time. And that evening, back at the house, Michael helped his father settle in. Frank was quieter than usual. Not withdrawn, not cold. Just heavy. Like something in him had been unlocked, and now the air around him felt different. He stood in the hallway, staring at the mirror again. For the first time, he removed the cap and placed it on the table beside him. Not because he had to, but because, for once, he wanted to. Michael watched from the doorway, saying nothing. The old man's silver hair was thinner now. The scar near his temple was faint but visible, and yet, what stood out most was the quiet determination in his eyes. Frank turned to his son. You ever wonder why I always wore that hat? Michael nodded. Yeah. Frank picked up the cap, held it loosely. It wasn't to hide something, it was to hold it in place. Michael stepped closer. You don't have to anymore. Frank didn't respond. But he didn't put the cap back on either. The night before the surgery, Frank couldn't sleep. Michael had gone upstairs to the guest room, but Frank remained in the living room, seated in his old recliner. The lights off, the house wrapped in stillness. Outside, the wind whispered against the eaves, rattling the branches of the ancient oaks that guarded the property. The fireplace, long unused, stood cold and clean behind its mesh screen. On the mantel, Helen smiled from inside her frame, forever young, forever waiting. Frank held a glass of water in his lap, unfinished, untouched. Then, like a reel beginning to turn in an old projector, the past came flickering back. April 1969. Da Nang, Vietnam. The air was hot and thick with humidity. Frank was 22, barely old enough to rent a car back home, but old enough to command a squad, old enough to write death notifications, old enough to carry the weight of boys who didn't come back. They had been on patrol that morning. His unit, 6 men, all young, all wide-eyed, had moved through a dense stretch of jungle just north of the city. A routine sweep, they were told. Nothing expected. But war never kept its promises. The first shell hit to the left, blowing open the earth in a violent fountain of dirt and fire. The second came seconds later, closer, too close. Frank remembered the sound before anything else. A ringing, A high-pitched scream inside his skull, then silence, then chaos. He came to with blood in his mouth and fire in his head. His right hand was pressed to his temple, and when he pulled it away, it was red, slick and pulsing. Someone was shouting. Someone else was crying. The jungle spun around him like a carousel gone mad. "Corpman! Corpman!" 2 of his men were already gone. Another, Sammy, the youngest, was holding his stomach, blood pouring through his fingers like it was trying to escape faster than time allowed. Frank couldn't move. He tried to speak, but his tongue was lead. His ears rang with such intensity he thought his head might split in half. And then the field medic was there, hands on his skull, flashlight in his eyes. "He's got shrapnel near the temple," someone yelled. "Can't get it out here." Voices came in and out like static. Frank floated above himself, watching the scene unfold from a distance, his own body lying motionless, mouth agape, eyes dazed. He remembered the helicopter, the dust, the burning oil, the sky so bright it hurt to look at it. He woke up in a field hospital 2 days later. A doctor stood at his bedside, clipboard in hand, face serious but not unkind. "You're lucky, Sergeant Delaney," the man had said. The fragment came within a centimeter of rupturing the middle meningeal artery. But it didn't. "We closed the wound, stabilized you," Frank had asked, voice gravelly. "Did you take it out?" The doctor shook his head. "Too dangerous. Removing it could kill you. It's better to leave it. If it doesn't move, it won't harm you. But you'll need to be careful. Always." Frank remembered staring at the ceiling for a long time after that, long enough to memorize every crack in the plaster, every stain in the tile. Something about that decision, about leaving it in, felt like an unfinished sentence, a door he wasn't allowed to walk through. When he returned stateside weeks later, Helen met him at the station. Her smile faltered when she saw the way he walked, the way he hesitated before stepping off the train. He told her about the injury, but not the full truth, only that he'd gotten clipped and that the doctors fixed it. She pressed him for details. He changed the subject. Again and again. Then the dreams started. Every night the jungle came back, the smell of wet earth and metal, the cries of the wounded, the fire, the sound of the shell hitting nearby, and then the silence. Always the silence. He'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Helen would hold him, whispering his name, her fingers running through his hair, always avoiding the left side. After a while, she stopped asking. He started wearing the cap shortly after that. At first, it was to keep the sun off the scar, then it became habit, then identity, then armor. He wore it everywhere, even at home, even to bed. When Michael was born, Frank thought it would be different. He told himself he'd be a better father than his own had been, more open, more present. But something had calcified in him, the same way the doctors had said the bone had grown around the shrapnel. His emotions were buried under scar tissue. His voice had grown quiet, his gestures restrained. He loved his son deeply, fiercely, but he didn't know how to show it. Helen would nudge him sometimes. "Tell him you're proud," she'd say. "I show him," Frank replied. "That's not the same." But Frank didn't change, and when Helen got sick, he sat beside her bed in silence, holding her hand, not knowing what to say, not even at the end. She died with his name on her lips, and he never spoke hers again. After the funeral, Michael had confronted him. "You didn't even cry," Michael had said, voice breaking. "You didn't even say goodbye." Frank had stared out the window, the cap still on his head. "I said goodbye a long time ago," he whispered. And just like that, the distance between father and son became a canyon, one neither was brave enough to cross. Now, sitting alone in the quiet of the present, Frank breathed deeply, eyes still fixed on Helen's photograph. He thought of the fragment inside him, not just the one in his skull, but the others, the fragments of memory, of love, of guilt, that had never been removed. The war hadn't ended when he came home, it had just gone quiet, and now for the first time in over 50 years he was choosing to face it, to let someone in, to let something out. He stood slowly, walked to the desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. He picked up a pen. Then, with a hand steadier than it had been in weeks, he began to write. The operating room was colder than Frank had expected. He lay on the sterile table beneath a canopy of lights that buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow over the team gathered around him. Tubes and wires coiled around his arms and chest like vines. A mask covered his nose and mouth, sending a gentle flow of oxygen into his lungs. Machines stood like silent sentinels beside him, blinking, measuring, watching. Dr. Lin stood at the head of the table, her eyes focused, her voice calm but clipped as she coordinated with her team. Vitals are steady. Let's keep it that way. The anesthesiologist nodded. BP is holding at 118/76. Heart rate, 72. Oxygen, 98%. A nurse adjusted the tray of instruments, rows of gleaming tools lined like soldiers in formation. Forceps, retractors, scalpels, a high-speed drill. Dr. Lin turned to her resident. We start with a left temporal incision. Keep the bone window small, minimal invasion. Understood. Frank closed his eyes beneath the mask. The last thing he saw before sleep took him was the overhead light fracturing into a halo of white, then darkness. When first cut was clean, scalpel through skin, a gentle parting, practiced and precise. Beneath the scalp, the surgeon exposed layers of tissue and muscle. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. No room for error. Not here. Retract, Dr. Lin instructed. A faint hiss from the suction tube. Blood drawn away. A nurse dabbed the edges of the incision. Then came the drill. The sound rose above the beeping monitors, a shrill, mechanical whirring that echoed off the sterile tile. The burr bit into bone, sending fine dust into the air, caught immediately by the vacuum. A small square piece of skull was carefully removed and set aside in a stainless steel tray with a hollow clink. And there it was, a glimpse into a man's mind. Dr. Lin leaned in, headlamp illuminating the exposed dura, the tough membrane surrounding the brain. Pulse is strong. Slight swelling on the anterior margin, she murmured. She made a small incision into the dura. The brain pulsed gently beneath, and there it sat. The fragment, wedge-shaped, blackened at one edge, surrounded by a halo of fibrotic tissue and fine capillaries, like a splinter of war embedded in time. Dr. Lin froze for a moment, just long enough for one of the residents to whisper, "Is that really it?" She nodded. "This is what's been pressing against the parietal lobe." She leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "It's not a standard shrapnel shard," she said. "There are markings on it." She reached for magnifying loupes. With them she could see faint etchings, tiny letters, barely legible. M67, she blinked, from a grenade. Another nurse stepped forward. Could that have been inside him all this time? Dr. Lin's jaw tensed. He's a walking anomaly. Any sign of movement? Minimal, but it's close to the cortical vein. One slip. She didn't finish the sentence. Instead, she reached for the microforceps and began. A silence in the room thickened as the team watched. Monitors beeped steadily in the background, tracking every beat of Frank's heart, every breath from the ventilator. His body lay still, but inside his skull, history trembled. Dr. Lin eased the forceps around the base of the fragment, her hands perfectly steady. She cut along the adhesions separating tissue from metal. Each millimeter was a negotiation between risk and success. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of her face. Blood pressure rising slightly, the anesthesiologist said. "Stay on it, doctor," Lin replied without looking up. She made one final movement. Then, gently, reverently, she lifted the fragment free. It was darker than they expected, nearly blackened by age, edges jagged. She set it into the surgical dish. It landed with a weighty clang, a sound that seemed to echo beyond the room, reverberating through decades. The team exhaled collectively, but it wasn't over. "Wait," the anesthesiologist said, his BP's dropping. 90/60, heart rate ticked up, 85, 92, 104. "Cerebral vein might be compromised," Dr. Lin snapped. "Clamp now." A spurt of blood welled near the surgical site. Suction. Applying gelfoam, elevating BP with norepinephrine. Frank's chest rose and fell more rapidly under the respirator. His heart rate hit 120. Dr. Lin's fingers moved faster now, closing vessels, applying pressure, reinforcing the area with hemostatic matrix. BP 98/70. Stabilizing, heart rate dropping, back to 96, we're good. The room breathed again. Dr. Lin sat back slowly. She stared at the piece of shrapnel in the tray, then at the open skull before her. 56 years, she thought. 56 years this man walked around with a grenade fragment inside his head. The war had never ended for him, it had just moved in. And whilst hours later, the bone flap was replaced, the skin sutured, the area bandaged neatly. Frank's vitals returned to baseline. He was moved to recovery. Michael stood outside the glass panel, arms crossed, watching as nurses adjusted IVs and monitors. Dr. Lin joined him. "He's a miracle," she said softly. Michael nodded. He won't call himself that. I've seen cases like this. Foreign bodies, retained shrapnel, but never one so close to the cortex, and so untouched. Michael turned to her. Did he say anything before he went under? She hesitated, then smiled faintly. Just one thing. He said, if anything goes wrong, tell my son. I wore the hat so he wouldn't see the wound, but I kept it on because I didn't know how to heal it. Michael stared at the floor, throat tight. In the tray nearby, the fragment sat still, lifeless, ordinary, and yet it had been the most powerful object in Frank's life. It had silenced his joy, held his grief, frozen his heart, and now it was out. The waiting room was nearly empty. Michael sat alone beneath the flickering fluorescent lights, a styrofoam cup of cold coffee in his hands, untouched for hours. The world outside had shifted from afternoon into evening without him noticing. Through the windows, the sky bled into shades of deep purple and charcoal gray, dusk swallowing the horizon. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes locked on the tile floor, like it might offer answers no one else could. In his lap rested his father's cap. For the first time in Michael's life, the cap wasn't on Frank's head. It felt wrong, unnatural, as if part of the world had tilted slightly off its axis. He ran his fingers over the worn brim, the faint stitching along the inside edge, the sweat-stained fabric. This object, which he had once mocked, now felt heavier than metal. A nurse passed by and paused near the door, then entered quietly. He's out of surgery, she said gently. Michael stood immediately, voice caught in his throat. And he's stable, for now, she said. But there were complications. He lost more blood than expected. We've moved him to ICU. Michael felt his knees weaken but held his ground. Can I see him? She nodded. Not just yet. We need a little more time. The doctor will come speak with you soon. She left as quietly as she came. He sat back down. More waiting. The minutes dragged, slowed by worry, stretched by fear. Each second that passed was another reminder that time was not promised. He thought about the last words his father had said before being wheeled into surgery, the way he'd grabbed Michael's wrist, not firmly, but with meaning. If I don't wake up, you take care of what's left. Not the hat, not the house, what's left in here. He'd tapped his chest, just over his heart, and now he was behind closed doors, fighting silently for breath, for blood, for one more sunrise. Michael stood, began pacing. He passed the same painting on the wall 3 times, a watercolor of a beach, calm and pastel, utterly indifferent to the war being waged behind the ICU glass. He checked the clock, and waited. Inside the ICU, Frank's body lay still, pale beneath the thin hospital sheet. Tubes emerged from his arms, his mouth, his chest. Machines blinked softly. A nurse monitored the panel, adjusting drips, checking vitals. Dr. Lin stood beside her, arms folded, watching the numbers. BP's low, heart rate irregular. He's losing perfusion, the nurse said. Start pressors, warm him, prep for transfusion if needed. Dr. Lin stepped closer to the bed. She looked at Frank, his face drawn, lips slightly parted, eyelids fluttering from some distant nightmare. He's not responding to stimulus, the nurse said quietly. Dr. Lin sighed. He's been carrying trauma for 50 years. Now that it's gone, his body doesn't know what to do. The nurse hesitated. You think he gave up? Dr. Lin shook her head. No, he's trying to find himself again. When Michael was finally allowed in, the beep of machines and the smell of antiseptic greeted him like a slap. He stepped inside the room slowly. Frank looked smaller, older, as if all the decades he'd been holding back had collapsed into him in one night. Michael pulled up a chair, sat, held his father's hand. You can stay, a nurse said. Talk to him. He might hear you. She left the room quietly. Michael stared at the man who had once seemed unbreakable. The man who had taught him how to patch a tire, how to hold a fishing rod, how to build a fire, but never how to say I love you. You don't get to leave like this, Michael whispered. The machines beeped in rhythm. He looked down at the cap still in his hands. I used to hate this thing, he said. I thought it was dumb, hiding under a hat like some old relic. But now I get it. He swallowed. You weren't hiding, you were carrying. You carried all of it, alone. Michael leaned forward, resting his forehead against his father's hand. I should have asked. I should have listened. But I was angry. I thought you didn't care. I didn't know you were just trying to hold everything together. He felt tears rise but didn't hold them back. I'm here now, Dad. I'm not leaving. So you better not either. Outside, the clock struck midnight. Inside, a flicker. Frank's fingers twitched. Just barely. A nurse caught it on the monitor. Doctor, movement in left hand. Dr. Lin stepped back into the room. Increase oxygen, hold pressors. Let's see if he stabilizes on his own. Michael looked up. He saw it too, the faintest tightening of the hand he held. Hope cracked through the fear like sunlight breaking through cloud. He stood, leaned closer. Dad? A pause, then so quiet it barely registered. Frank's eyelids moved. Frank's eyes opened slowly, like a window being lifted after years of rust. At first, the world around him was a blur of pale light and indistinct shapes. There was a soft hissing sound, the quiet rhythm of machines breathing for him, measuring him, keeping time like an invisible orchestra. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar, white, cold, and too bright. He blinked once. Then again, the machines beeped in acknowledgement. He turned his head slightly and felt the weight of his own body, heavy, sore, but alive. Beside him, a figure slumped in a chair, arms crossed, chin tucked into chest, fast asleep. Michael. Frank tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was raw, dry, like it had been dragged through gravel. He managed a faint groan, just enough to stir the air. Michael's head snapped up, his eyes locked on Frank's. For a moment, neither said a word. The space between them was filled with everything unsaid over the past 6 years, and maybe even longer. Then Michael leaned in, breath caught in his throat. Hey, he said softly. You're awake. Frank's lips parted, but the sound was barely audible. Still, it was a word. Yeah. Michael swallowed hard. You scared the hell out of me. Frank blinked, almost smiled. Scared. Myself. They sat in silence for a beat. Michael reached over and carefully adjusted the oxygen tube resting along his father's face. The doctor said you're going to be okay. Slow recovery, but stable. Frank nodded slowly, weak but present. The metal. Michael nodded back. Gone. They got it. Frank let out a long breath, his eyes drifting to the window. Morning light had begun to filter in, soft and golden, stretching across the sheets like a quiet promise. I thought, he began, his voice raspy, that it was part of me. Michael looked at him, unsure. The fragment? Frank turned back to face him. Yeah, that thing. For 50 years it was like proof that I made it, that it mattered. Michael said nothing. Frank continued. And the hat, it wasn't just to hide it, it was to remind me that I still had something in me that could kill me if I wasn't careful. Michael's eyes misted. That's why you never took it off. Frank nodded. I wore it to sleep, to weddings, to Mom's funeral, you remember? Michael's throat tightened. Yeah, I remember. Frank's gaze grew distant. She hated that hat. But she never said a word. She knew it meant something. Frank looked at his son. I never told her how bad it was. I never told you either, about the dreams, the noise, the silence. Michael leaned back in the chair, rubbing his hands together. I used to think you didn't love us. Frank flinched, barely, but the pain was real, I know. I thought you were cold, Michael said. Closed off. Frank nodded slowly. I was why Michael asked, almost pleading. Why didn't you just talk to me? Frank looked at the ceiling for a long moment, then back at Michael. Because I was afraid, he said. Afraid that if I opened my mouth it would all come pouring out. The blood, the guilt, the screams, and I wouldn't know how to stop it. He paused, then added, and because I didn't want you to see me as broken. Michael shook his head. You were never broken, just locked up. Frank smiled faintly. Well, I guess someone found the key. They sat there, father and son, with sunlight now painting the walls in warmer tones. The tension in the room had changed, not disappeared, but shifted, from confrontation to connection. I found your letter, Michael said. Frank raised an eyebrow. You weren't supposed to. I know, but I'm glad I did. Michael pulled it from his coat pocket, unfolded the worn sheet of paper, and began to read aloud. To Helen he read, voice trembling, if I don't wake up, tell our boy I'm sorry. Tell him I loved you both more than my own breath, even when I couldn't say it. Tell him I carried the war inside me, and I didn't know how to put it down. But I never stopped trying. Frank closed his eyes. Tears slipped from the corners. Michael reached for his hand. You don't have to carry it anymore. It's over. You're home. Frank squeezed his hand weakly. Feels like the first time. Later that day, Frank sat up for the first time. Nurses cheered quietly from the doorway. Dr. Lynn checked his vitals and smiled. You're strong, she said. Most men don't walk away from a surgery like that. I didn't walk, Frank muttered. I got dragged back. She chuckled. Well, I'm glad you didn't go quietly. Before she left, she handed Michael a small container. The fragment, she said. Some patients want it, others don't. Michael looked at his father. Frank stared at it for a long time. then nodded. Michael placed the container on the side table, next to Frank's glasses and the cap. Frank reached for the hat, turned it over in his hands, then looked at Michael. "You want it?" Michael hesitated. "You're not going to wear it anymore?" Frank smiled. "I think I've earned a break." At night, in the quiet of the hospital room, they talked. Not about the war, not about the pain, but about fishing trips, about Helen's cooking, about Michael's job in Boston, about the time Frank taught him how to ride a bike and didn't let go until he crashed into a bush. They laughed, they cried, they remembered, and for the first time in decades, the silence between them wasn't a wall, it was a bridge. 2 weeks later, Frank stood at the edge of his porch, staring out across the stretch of lawn that dipped into a shallow grove of trees. The morning sun warmed the side of his face, and the air smelled faintly of pine and dew. It was the first time he had stood outside without a hat in over 50 years. He wore a light flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, slippers on his feet. His hair, though thin and streaked with gray, stirred gently in the breeze. Michael stood a few feet behind him, coffee in hand, watching his father from the doorway. The quiet between them was no longer tense. It had become something different, peaceful, almost companionable. Frank took a deep breath and released it slowly. "I forgot how the air feels on my scalp," he said. Michael chuckled. "Kind of nice, huh?" Frank gave a slow nod. "Vulnerable. But yeah, nice." The surgery scar was healing well. Faint stitches still marked his temple, but the swelling had gone down. His balance had returned, and the headaches had ceased. The doctors called it a textbook recovery, but for Frank, it felt like something more, like rebirth. Inside the house, on a small wooden table near the fireplace, sat 2 items side by side. One was a sealed glass case containing a single shard of dark metal, the fragment that had once lived inside his skull. The other was the brown canvas cap, now clean, folded neatly, resting beside it like an old soldier standing watch. Frank hadn't touched either since coming home. Some things, he decided, should stay exactly where they are, not forgotten but no longer carried. He and Michael had fallen into a new rhythm. They ate breakfast together every morning, sometimes in silence, sometimes telling stories from decades past. Michael had extended his stay, postponing work meetings and conference calls, choosing instead to spend time with a man he was just beginning to truly know. One afternoon, Michael asked, "Do you ever think you'll wear the hat again?" Frank smiled. "Maybe, one day, but I want to learn how to walk without it first." They began taking walks around the neighborhood, short at first, then longer. Neighbors stopped them, surprised to see Frank bareheaded and smiling. Some offered awkward greetings, others shared warm hugs. The same people who once whispered about old hat Frank now saw a different man, someone lighter, somehow younger. Mrs. Moore brought over her famous peach cobbler and nearly dropped the dish when she saw Frank open the door with his head uncovered. "My word," she said, "I never thought I'd see the day." Frank grinned. "Neither did I." On Sunday they went to the lake, the same one Frank had fished at for years in solitude. This time, Michael carried the rods. Frank sat on the dock with his feet dangling over the edge, watching the ripples glide across the water. "You know," Frank said, "I used to come here after your mother died. Sit for hours, didn't even bring bait sometimes." Michael cast his line, glanced at him. "Just to think?" Frank nodded. "Just to be, to let the silence say what I couldn't." Michael reeled in a bit of slack. "And now?" Frank turned to him. "Now I think I'd rather talk." They didn't catch much that day. But that wasn't the point. That evening, Frank pulled out an old notebook from his drawer, one he hadn't touched in years. He flipped through pages of unfinished letters, scribbled poems, and journal entries too painful to complete. He added a new entry. "I don't know what healing looks like, but I think it feels like this. A cup of coffee with your son, a morning without a hat, a breath without pain, a silence that doesn't echo." He closed the notebook and set it beside the glass case. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. Frank stepped out onto the porch again, Michael just behind him. "You ever think we'll forget?" Michael asked. Frank shook his head. "We're not supposed to forget. We're just not supposed to bleed every time we remember." Michael looked down at the cap. "Do you want to keep it out here, or put it away?" Frank took a moment, then said, "Let's leave it right there, where people can see it, where I can see it, not as a shield, just as a story." A few days later, a neighborhood kid rode by on his bike, eyes wide, stopping in front of their yard. "You're the guy with the hat," the boy said. Frank laughed. "Used to be." The boy pointed to the porch table. "What's that in the box?" Frank paused, then knelt down. "A reminder." "Of what?" Frank looked the boy in the eye. that sometimes the hardest thing a person can do is take something out before it breaks them. The boy didn't fully understand, but he nodded anyway and rode off down the street. Some wounds don't bleed, some scars don't show on skin, but live quietly in the spaces between breaths, in the silence between words, in the weight of something never said. For Frank Delaney, healing didn't come from medicine alone. It came from choosing to remember, to speak, to be seen. It came from taking off the hat. The same could be true for any of us. We all carry something, some fragment from the past we've learned to live with, maybe even built our identity around. It might be a mistake, a memory, a loss, a silence. We wear it like armor, like a habit, like a second skin. And we tell ourselves that taking it off would be dangerous, too painful. But sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to lift the lid, to reach in, to take it out. This isn't just a story about war or trauma. It's a story about legacy, about family, about the quiet courage it takes to unlearn what kept us safe and step into what makes us whole. Maybe you're like Michael, watching someone you love carry a burden you can't understand. Maybe you're like Frank, trying to make peace with something long buried. Or maybe you're just someone who knows what it feels like to be silent for too long. Whatever your story is, maybe today is the day to ask, what am I still carrying, and what would it look like to finally put it down? If this story spoke to you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever kept something hidden for years? Do you know someone like Frank, a parent, a friend, a veteran, who wore their silence like a shield? Leave a comment below and tell us what this story stirred in you. And if you believe someone else needs to hear it, share it, because sometimes stories are the best medicine we have. Thank you for spending this time with us. And remember, some hats are meant to come off, some fragments are meant to be removed, and some hearts are finally ready to be healed. We'll see you next time with another story that just might change the way you see the world, or yourself. Until then, be kind to your memories. They're not always the enemy. Sometimes, they're just waiting to be understood.